Hello, everyone. We are going to be talking about the appendices this time and possibly also looking at object types. And I just want to thank Vitus. I know you've done quite a bit on the object types, and I know Stephen took a look at this as well. So perhaps we'll get to that. I don't want to prioritize the appendices because that's something that needs a bit of fleshing out. With that in mind, I guess before we get started, I just want to check in because it's been a while since we were together. Does anyone have any questions or any thoughts about something that we should be looking at?
I'm sure I have questions because I've largely been out of the loop, but those can wait until later, I assume.
All right, that's fine. Anytime. So anytime you have questions, feel free to jump in and help us keep going on a good track. So I thought when I started doing the appendices, and just to give you context in case you haven't looked at it recently, I'm looking at doing an appendix for each of the three major use cases: full cache, partial cache, and notifications. And I want to do it from the perspective of what would the provider need to do to support this particular use case, and what would the consumer do to process change documents that are able to do this use case. And so we'll do this for each one. And I'm fairly familiar with the full cache. So I did what I consider to be a fairly complete run at that one. I would certainly want to get eyes on it, like especially from Dave, because I know you're doing a full cache. And so it'd be good to get your perspective on that to make sure that I haven't missed something. The other two use cases are fairly empty, and I'm definitely looking to get some feedback from others in the group who may have more experience in those particular areas. So just real quick, I'll kind of go through the full cache just to see how it's laid out now and see if anyone has any comments on this while we're together. And certainly feel free to read it more closely offline and make comments as much as you feel. So the basic description is that a consumer maintains a full cache of an authoritative data set, and I probably should add a little bit more on there, and wants to take incremental updates to be able to keep the cache as up to date as possible. So the provider support for that is to create an activity stream that supports incremental updates of a full cache. And to do that, they create a dated baseline full download, and periodically they'll create another full download at given points in time. And that just allows the consumer to know at certain points in time that they have a full cache. And then in between the full downloads, the activity stream will be the incremental update data. So the activity stream will be created, and updates, any updates in the activity stream will be from the baseline it's associated with. So all additions and modifications of entities in the baseline are recorded as an action in the activity stream, and they'll be released in batch sets. So that's the collection pages. Each collection page will be a batch set of modifications. Everything is ordered, so it comes with a date in order, and you process them in order. So and I just made a comment in there about the fact that these are linked lists because they point forward and back. And the activity stream, so each action in the activity stream includes an instrument with an RDF patch. And that RDF patch is what allows for the incremental updates. And they have to be processed in order. So I did try to put in there some challenges I thought would happen. And on the provider side, I think the challenge, because Kevin, you've mentioned before that LOC just really doesn't have the data, at least at this point in time, to be able to create an RDF patch. And so I just want to—
That is correct.
Yeah.
Well, so, no, excuse me. We might have the data to create a RDF patch of the entire resource. We don't know what changed though, so it's all or nothing. but we might have the ability to create a patch for for the whole resource.
Okay. So the RDF patch would typically be the diff from what it was to what it is.
If that is what the RDF patch would need to be or is expected to be, we cannot do that. Yes.
Okay. Yeah, because it has a whole series of adds and deletes, and that's basically what's in the patch. And it doesn't have the whole document. It just has what's added and what's deleted. So I just wanted to recognize that for some providers that may be a challenge and fairly difficult to overcome. So I do want to put that in there. So on the consumer side, the initial cache is going to be created from a full download. So you see the initial cache, it says bring everything in just the complete download. And then you go to the associated activity stream and just start cranking through it. You start with the first page and navigate to the instrument for each activity and apply the RDF patch. And then you go to the next page and do the same. And you keep going until there's not another next page. And then you make a note of what the URL is of the last page processed, because now we're going to go to the second part, which is the regular incremental updates. You go to whichever page is the last page processed, and then you go to the next page and you process that. Navigate to the activity, apply the RDF patch, and then repeat until you get to the last page, which doesn't have a next. And then you record the URL. And it's so that's this basic iterative process. So I guess I'll stop there for a second and just see if that makes sense to folks, if there's something else I need to put in there. Just one comment, I guess I will put in the challenges to providers. I'll describe or at least include a link to what RDF patch is. And the one thing I was considering putting in is just examples. So this is all just using words and it assumes everybody, they know the rest of the document. So I think some examples would help make things a little clearer.
Yeah, so Lynette, this seems like what a standard Delta patching scheme would look like. One thing that does kind of strike me at the moment is one additional variation of this could be, here's the baseline initial download, and here is the diff to take you to the current status. So that what the provider would do is basically have the current set and the previous set, and anytime an update was done, they would just generate a diff between the previous dump and the current one, so that all you had to do was grab that one and apply it against the baseline. Slightly different model, but depending upon the frequency and so forth, it might be a viable scheme as well. So there would only ever be one diff. But as a consumer, you would have to keep the existing baseline to generate the current scheme from.
I guess the part I'm missing there, are you saying that there would be a full dump and from that point forward, there would be an activity stream, and even if there was another full dump, that activity stream would continue? So that if you didn't want to take a full dump when the next one came, you would just keep working with the same activity stream?
Well, I'm saying from the current full dump, the most recent full dump, there would be only one patch file. And then the patch file would get updated whenever the provider decided there needed to be a fresh external view of updated data. In other words, there'd always only be one target patch, and you'd always be applying that one target patch against the most recent full dump.
So
that avoids the chaining.
Right. So in that case, the provider, if something changed later, the provider would remove anything in the patch that was put in by a previous change because it may no longer apply.
No, it would be the sum of all of the modifications since the last full dump.
So it just keep tacking on to the end, whatever
Of
the
the
next
patch,
change
yeah.
was.
Right.
And it would not be by document, it would be by the full repository.
Yeah. Because for some of these, I think the patches would be more complex than the full dump would be.
With that, sorry, I'm testing being on a Zoom outside in a tent. The campus has provided folks, but so if the background noise is too much, I'm sorry. But in that case, couldn't you simply, or maybe this is what Lynette was getting at with the mention of the document, couldn't you just dereference the object and grab all the RDF? Is that the overlay strategy?
I guess I'm still assuming that the RDF patch file is against the full dump in the way the current scheme in the notes describes it. It's just that rather than having to worry about sequencing them correctly, there would only be one aggregate patch against the last baseline.
So would you, because I was just about to write the part about how to process that, would you see the processing being that you reset to the previous full dump and then apply the patches? Because otherwise, how would you know where you left off?
Yeah, but I guess from an implementation perspective, I'm not necessarily assuming that you're doing a live triple store that's in production, as opposed to like applying a patch file to an NT file. I know I think it's just something to keep in our back pocket for use cases that aren't quite the same as what we're thinking about. So if we're talking about, say, LC name authorities, that's a huge file. And so reapplying the patch to the huge file every time doesn't make any sense. But if you're talking about some of the smaller authorities, it's not that big a deal to grab the last full dump of the full authority and apply the patch to it. Well, the extreme of that is you do a full release each time. There's no need to do a patch. You just grab the current one and do a full replace, because it's simpler to do a full replace than it is to apply the patch. What I'm thinking about is the complexity of the sequential processing requirement for the current main scheme we're talking about.
So Dave, just so I make sure I understand you, if a patch, an early patch said label equals XYZ, and then a patch afterwards said change XYZ to ABC, the aggregate would just have the ABC.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
So real quick, I just want to capture this because I didn't catch it when you said it the first time. You said you would apply the patch file to
The last full release.
Oh, okay. You had a specific name and I wasn't sure what it was. And I figured it was something to do with the triple store itself, like a T
Yeah,
file.
I think I might have said last baseline, or anyway,
Okay.
apply to the last full dump.
I could certainly see where if this was in conjunction to the activity streams, that would be very useful, because if you're far behind, you could take the full dump, apply whatever that full patch file is. And then at that point, if you wanted to keep up to date, you could start following the activity stream. Although
Yeah.
I'm not sure, I guess you would do it based on the date, like to find which document is the last one processed. You'd have to like track backwards until you got to that date.
Yeah, and I guess the appeal here is if you're firing up from scratch, all you need is the full dump and the delta, and you're up to date. So you wouldn't have to worry about the fact that there may have been daily releases for the last year and a half that you have to worry about doing in order. I suspect that each of these schemes is going to have a sweet spot with respect to use cases.
Cool, I could see that. That would be a nice recommendation if they're able to do that. That would be very helpful. For that first time when you're first grabbing all the data, or in the case you said, like when it's really small, I think both of those would be helpful.
Yeah.
So any other thoughts or comments on the full cache approach?
I guess I'm just wondering, in the context of a full cache, what would be the value or purpose of having an activity stream, which seems to me would be an instrument to allow people or the consumer to be selective. But if you are trying to update everything, then you don't need to be selective. So what would be the purpose of having like activity type, object type, and so on?
So Vitus, I guess what I'm thinking about for the very large ones, so one of my share VD dump files, it takes forever to load a full release. So that first big inhale of data is measured in processor weeks. So these incremental updates would allow you to keep a very large cache up to date in a very amortized way, compared to some of those smaller ones where it takes, for some of these, it only takes me like 2 or 3 minutes to just do a full load and index of the whole thing. So there's no huge investment in just a total refresh. But for the very large sources, it's not feasible to even acquire the data on a regular basis as full releases. You got to have an incremental release if you want to stay in near real time up to date.
Right. I guess what I'm thinking is the provider could periodically generate a patch file that contains all the differences between what it is currently and what it was before, when the last patch was produced. So you could have a series of these patch files that a consumer could download and apply them one after another. And in that scenario, I'm still trying to think, well, why would you want to monitor the activity stream? Why not just download the patch files and apply them if you are trying to update everything?
Well, I guess that's the activity stream notion is assuming that the patch file is about one thing. I don't think that's necessarily required. I mean, the patch files are basically pointed to by the activity stream, and the provider has basically control over what the granularity of the patch is. It could be at the individual entity level, or it could be just, here's today's patches.
Yeah, so that's interesting that you said where's today's patches, because the first thing I thought of when Vitus asked this question is that I see activity streams as a way to be like as close to real time as possible. So if you are able to take the activity streams as they're produced, then you can, and your cache would be as close to up to date as is possible for that provider. Providers, I don't think, are going to do, when you talk about a large patch file, that's in my mind, I think of things that are going to come like at the smallest interval would be nightly, but maybe weekly or even quarterly. And so then I don't think you have that advantage of things being close to real time.
Well, depending upon the underlying technology, it could be the case that the activity streams generated at transaction commit time. I mean, that would be very fine grained, but that would imply that your latency between being up to date is now measured in minutes or seconds and not days. I'm not sure why you would need to be quite that in sync, but it's possible that that could be the case. I mean, you could create an implementation that accommodated that.
I will check in with Getty and see how often they produce theirs. Kevin, you guys aren't quite there yet where you're actually producing them. Is that correct?
We are super close.
Do you know what timing you're looking at releasing them?
It could happen this week.
I actually meant, like, are you planning to like update the activity streams daily, hourly, weekly?
Oh, I see what you're saying. It'll be daily. I mean, so the activity streams that we have are produced dynamically from the system. So we update the system on a daily basis, so the activity streams will be updated on a daily basis too, or will reflect the underlying updates.
Yeah, I think from a practical perspective, I wouldn't expect people to be finer grained and daily, but it all depends on when you trigger the background daemon that generates the new diff.
Right. So I do know Getty's not producing like RDF patch documents. I don't know of anyone who's doing that at this point. But I also don't know of anyone who's doing that like for their full dumps either. So like this step up here that we have, I don't know of anyone who's doing that either.
Yeah.
So this is really sort of an aspirational, gosh, this would be really nice if you could do this, because that's what would enable people to maintain these full caches. And I think the benefit to the provider is that if there are full caches out there that are reasonably up to date that consumers can go to, then the provider doesn't have to bear all the weight of having to be the uptime and the availability and throughput that's necessary to be able to be that for everyone. So
yeah, and I admit the extreme on this is what basically shadow database engines do in terms of two-phase commit, where the shadow is milliseconds behind the main, so that if the main fails, the shadow can take over. So from a high availability perspective, it means your triple store would never be down.
So I wonder, Vitus, having heard that, do you continue to have questions about why this would be done in this way, or?
I guess I still have that question a little bit. If the idea is that you will take all the changes and apply them, then all you need would be a patch file that reflects all the changes from yesterday or last week or whenever. Whereas the data, the information in the activity stream seems to me are there to enable some kind of selection.
Yeah, I think, Vitus, one way to think about the activity stream is it's basically just alerting you that there's a patch available to be applied. So you don't have to poll, you can actually wait for a stream. whatever we call the thing in the stream, a stream release to notify you. Are these things really streams like stream processing, or are they just calling them streams?
That's a
I
good
think they're
question.
mostly calling them streams.
Yeah, because I was
I
gonna
mean, I think, yeah. Go on, Lynette.
sorry, we keep stepping over each other there. The question I have for you, Kevin, and that really jumps down to the, not here, the notification process, because I was trying to describe what the provider side would look like. And just based on some of the things that you said previously in other meetings, it sounded like that at any given time, if you go and look at the stream, what you see is going to be only the latest update. And so you're only going to know that object X changed, and it may have changed 10 times prior to today, but it doesn't matter because today it says it changed. And so the way Getty has sort of done theirs, it's like you go to a URL and you get to the stream, and then from that you get to pages, and from that you get to the actions. And so I was just curious, like, how are you structuring your particular activity stream? Do you have it in something similar? And if, I guess I'm just not picturing what that would look like. How would that look?
It's a little similar. It's different though. So we're not, I mean, I haven't, I think you've spent more time looking at the Getty than I did. But I think I looked at it long enough based on your description to put it all together. Yeah, Getty is kind of like broken things up into groups, and then you kind of drill down.
Yes.
And they do things with like ordered collections,
Yeah.
and order collection pages. So we're doing ordered collections and ordered collection pages. But our update feeds are not grouped. How do I say this? They're not formally grouped in the way that you're seeing in out of the Getty. They are presented by scheme with the URL pattern. So this is, I'll show you a URL pattern in this, what I mean here. I'm not, because I know I'm not being very clear. So take that right there, for example. That's not, I don't think that'll work. Really don't. Might though. You never know what can make it into production. Anyway, if you see that pattern, imagine id.load.go sitting before it. We've decided to group things, and I'm using air quotes right now for group, based on the URI or the URL pattern. So activity streams / feed is just the feed, just the update feed, the generic update feed for everything in the genre form scheme. What we had devised was something like doing that in the future. So you'll note that I switched out the word feed for the word labels, and that might be the activity streams, the ordered collection pages for the activity streams of resources whose labels were updated in some way, which is a distinction from things like notes or some other bit of the record that might have been modified by a cataloger. That doesn't necessarily matter that much.
So in this case, what does the 27 mean?
That's page 27 for us.
Okay.
That would be ordered collection page number 27.
So if an object appeared in ordered collection page 26, and then it appeared in 27, would it get dropped off 26?
For that first pattern, it would. For the second pattern, we'll actually have to start tracking those changes. And so a label could, in theory, show up how do I say this? A resource, a modified resource could potentially show up in additional pages.
Yeah, so I could see, like you were talking about how it would only show up once. And would that be within a particular page, which is representative of a particular time period, let's say for a day? So 27 is a day,
It would
and
be,
if it got modified
it would
5
be,
times in that day, it would only show up once.
right. It would only show up, the update would only show up once per ordered collection.
Right. And so if yesterday that same object got updated, it would still be in the day 26 feed for whatever change that happened there, but it would still be in that feed only at most once.
Right.
That kind of makes sense to me, because I was trying to decide how you would, have a long running stream that would be anything from any date, and you'd have to take things in and out. But if you're doing it for a day, and the only thing you're doing is saying, on this day, this object changed. Or in the case of the second one, on this day, this label changed.
Right. However, I do want to say that, and we haven't developed this yet, so it's, how do I say this? So one of the things that we've done is we've just focused on the resource level activity stream. This resource was created, this resource was updated, this resource was deleted or removed from the system. The pattern that you see there for labels, we've not begun to develop yet. Or I should say we've begun to develop, but we stopped on that to go back to a simpler one. But anyway, where I'm going with this is that in theory, right now, it's possible that a resource could show up multiple times within a specific ordered collection for the labels right now. And the reason for that is because we actually have to track those changes. We have to know that a label changed yesterday and that a label changed again today.
So in this particular, in this second feed, are you expecting to have the label text itself be part of the document?
Hadn't gotten there yet, actually, but
Okay.
that would be feasible based on our conversations with the whole RDF patch, 1, and 2, more to the point, it's feasible because we actually know what changed at that point. But honestly, we put it to the side for the time being and haven't really thought about it. So those types of questions that you're asking is to be determined. Yeah. I suspect, knowing us, we will include the text because it would save people a potential lookup, and it's an easy thing to include at that point.
Right. And for these, you're basically, it would be created and then a URI of the item that got created or updated or removed.
More or less, yeah. And it's more like add, updated, and removed, but yeah.
So I wonder if others have any thoughts on the notification process. So especially Vitus, because I know you've talked about notifications quite a bit. When you hear the description that Kevin was giving, does that make sense to you as a notification system? Is there something else that you're looking for that you would expect in the activity stream?
That the two different patterns, yeah, they sound like that they could be really helpful in depending on what you have cache. Like in the case of Sinopia, we have a URI and a label, let's say for a name of a person. And if the name, if the heading for that person has changed, and we have this activity stream that tells us that, okay, this heading has changed, then Sinopia could update the records that have that name. And in the case of, let's say, our ILS, where we have the entire record in our system, and if we know that, okay, this record has been updated today, then that could be a trigger to get the latest version of that record.
Yeah, so that kind of gets into the partial cache idea. So partial cache is you're not caching everything. You just have a particular object and you've cached some part of that object. So it may be the label, it could be anything from the object, but you're only caching a few pieces of it. And I wondered if this sort of notification pattern wouldn't work well for that as well, because you find it says update, and you know it's the URI, you know that you have something cached for that URI. So, and you know what you have cached for that URI. So you just go out and look for that particular piece of data in the URI that is changed, and then you can update your system. So it seems to me that this notification pattern would work well for labels and for any other piece of partial cache that you have.
Yeah, I think it would work for partial in the sense that you don't have the entire data set. You only have a partial data set. You have only downloaded certain records from that data set. You may have the entire record, it's just not the whole data set.
I wonder if the one little challenge here would be if you're only keeping like 2 or 3 pieces of data and you know what those 2 or 3 pieces of data are, then it's fairly easy to dereference the URI and grab the data you want. If you are indeed actually caching the whole record, then we come back to those the challenges we've talked about previously about knowing where the edges of the graph are. So in that case, would you remove the entire graph associated with that URI as best as you can tell where the edges are, and then just grab everything new again as best as you can tell where the edges of the graph are? You grab everything associated with that URI.
Yeah, that's my assumption, that there is a way to define the boundaries of a particular description.
So any other thoughts about this notification system and how that could also work for partial caching?
I guess I'm not fully understanding the differences between the notification system and an activity stream.
So in my view, this is an activity stream that is serving as a notification system. It is, you would still have to watch it, as opposed to, it would be a polling process as opposed to the notification system pushing something to you. So you would be watching the stream to see if any URIs that you have that you find of interest, if they appear in the activity stream, then you would want to take an action. So it's not a notification in the sense that it's pushing information out to you based on like some configured set of URIs. I do think someone could create a system like that based off of the activity stream. So the big difference between the notification and the full cache version is there's just not near as much details in the activity stream itself about what has happened.
So maybe the document should make it clearer that notification is also a type of activity stream. It just doesn't have the same details or link to RDF patches, or something like that.
Yeah, I do think that, again, this kind of brings me back to the idea of actually producing some examples in the appendices, because I think that would make that kind of thing, information clearer. Yes, I don't think it's just that it includes fewer details. There are some structural differences as well, like on a given page for a given day, if you update the same URI 3 times, it'll still only appear in there once. So there's still some slight differences between those two. But we can definitely flesh that out a little more in the description. So there's a question in the chat about what partial is. Does it mean that the consumer is only keeping parts of the data for all the entities of interest, or all data about only the entities of interest? I think both. I think it can be either one of those. So in some cases, I only want, I hesitate to go to label because we've got this thing that talks just about label, and we've talked about labels, but label is the most common thing to cache. So I have a URI and I have a label, and the only thing I'm caching is the label, maybe a description. And so that's a pretty simple case, because then every time I want to update it, I just need to know the URI changed, and I go grab the label and description again. The other is that I'm caching, but when I cache something, I cache the entire, I hate saying record because it doesn't really, the entire graph. So I'm caching the entire graph for a particular URI. And that becomes a little more challenging because it's harder to know where the edges of the graph are. But I guess I'm not really sure how to solve that, other than saying that the consumer and the producer both have knowledge about the data that they're looking at and have some expectation of what the shape of the graph would be. If you are keeping the full entity, it might be easier to process the full cache approach to activity streams where it has the RDF patch, because then you just apply the RDF patch and you don't have to worry about the edges of the graph.
Would an advantage, just a question, would an advantage of caching the whole thing be to be able to find things like, this is an entry term for this, but it's not the actual term? What would be the advantage?
Of a full cache?
Yeah.
Versus just knowing the URI?
Yeah.
So the main difference, there's 2 main differences that I'm seeing come out of this. So the full cache will have an activity for every, at some point in time, they're going to create a diff between what was and what is, and they'll create an activity and there'll be an RDF patch associated with that. And on the notifications, you just have this URI updated and you don't know anything about what updated. And so the full cache approach, you can take that RDF patch and apply it to a triple store and have that triple store then match whatever the source is. On the notifications, you have to kind of figure out for yourself what changed. So I will say that if a producer produces the full cache version with the RDF patches, anyone who wants notifications could process that same stream. it might be slightly more complicated because they can't just look at the last date. They can't just know that that thing changed once during the day. They have to kind of look multiple times potentially. I don't know. I have to think about that. Like if what you want is notifications and what you get is the full cache version, how would you process that? It might be slightly different than what was described for the LOC example. Did I make that more confusing instead of less confusing?
No,
Thinking out loud when I was doing all that.
no, it's all right. No, it was fine, Lynette.
I think that was helpful, but I think, as you said earlier, adding some examples might help to tease apart the differences.
Yeah, I definitely think this document is getting to the point where maybe next time we get together, it will be at a point where we'll want everyone to sort of read through it in detail and, you know, find where things make sense or don't make sense and when they have questions. Because I think we are at the point where we need to sort of, we're ready to start tightening things up and making sure that the wording is such that it's not confusing and makes sense to people. So I will definitely be looking for reviewers in the near future. So we have about 7 minutes left. I'm wondering if there's other questions about these appendices or anything we've talked about today.
Lynette, this is Kevin. I just wanted to say something super quick here. So first of all, just to one of the points you were making just a second ago, at the end of the day, I think that how do I say this? Whomever is going to consume data from one of these services will absolutely have to be familiar with the service, you know, what it's giving, the shape of the data, all of that. So I think that I guess what I'm saying is we cannot possibly account for every variation. As at some point, someone's just going to have to know what they're, you know, is going to have to fully investigate what they're getting from a provider. The other thing I wanted to just kind of throw out there and say, just kind of commentary, because the fact that a resource might be updated three times a day and it's not known keeps coming up. What I want to say from at least our perspective, a record might be updated 3 times a day, but specifically when it comes to id.loc.gov, we only push updates once a day. So even if that resource had been updated the previous day 6 times, by the time it hits the public service, none of that is known. The only thing that is known is the last time it was updated. And so from a consumer's perspective, they need only hit id.loc.gov 1 time a day, and they will be as up to date as they can be, all things considered. And I think that might be the case with other systems too, which is to say that it diminishes a little bit of the questions around what if it's updated several times a day. But let's follow that all the way out. I think that if a resource, let's imagine that weren't the case with ID, and that ID, something seriously could be updated 6 times a day. I think any consumer at that point building a service that is built that targets id.loc.gov would have to do one of 2 things. Either one, they would need to know that potentially the resource was updated 6, well, maybe not even 1, it matters. Any system targeting id.loc.gov, and that's what they should be doing right now, should have in mind the last time they connected to id.loc.gov. And they should only crawl through the data back to that point. And if they do that, it wouldn't matter if the resource is updated 6 times in 1 day. They would either get all the updates, and then they'd have to order it carefully in order to apply them. But even if there's just 1 update in there, they'll get it all. So the point being is one of the things that we're missing from this mix is that any consumer has got to be doing their own part to ensure that they're not accidentally taking too much or applying things badly. Hope that was somewhat coherent.
Oh, Kevin, it made sense to me because I actually had the reverse happen to me with clinicaltrials.gov. They used to let me scan a list. I could grab clinical trial metadata for only the ones I didn't have. And then they went to having a single zip file with all of the data. So now I'm forced to inhale all of the data every day to be able to find out what's new. And yes, I do actually, for the other types of data that I crawl, I do keep a last access timestamp so I can tell just what the delta is that I need to acquire and nothing more.
So Stephen.
Yeah, for whatever it's worth, we set up a completely, this is completely independent of activity streams or anything that we're talking about, but you know, we sync data out of our Voyager system now, but it's a full-on sync process. So I keep exact track of the last second that we checked, and only ever need to go back to the last time we successfully executed a sync. If a sync fails for some reason or other, it will not update, and I will always go back to that last data, that last point in time that we synced. So there's a burden on the consumer to get some of this right too. And to Stephen's point, that was my first point, that like, you know, any consumer's got to know, you know, has got to investigate what they're getting out of the target system.
Yeah, so that's great. I appreciate this conversation today because that really gives me a lot more information to work with in writing the appendices. And I will take all of this information and try and distill it down into the various appendices, and we can take another look at it next time. So we didn't get to object types, and I'm not surprised because I did know it would take a bit on working through these appendices. That I do feel like the appendices are very important to give people a better sense of how this all is supposed to work. So we are out of time for today, and I want to thank everyone for your participation. It was a very good discussion today.
Thank you.
Talk to you later.